Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. Welcome to another episode of Learn with Flo. Super excited to be here with you guys today. I'm always just so excited about all of the different conversations that I have behind the scenes and one-on-one and group setting courses and all of the great questions that I get. And I'm just constantly soaking in and making notes about all of these different conversations because I feel like they make great Learn with Flo topics. And then everybody I know doesn't always have an opportunity to necessarily meet or work with me in a one-on-one setting or a group setting. And so we get an opportunity to kind of talk about some things at a high level, obviously not a personalized approach on these conversations, but I just couldn't help myself of really diving into the topic around cortisol today. And the reason why I really want to dive into the topic of cortisol is because number one, I'm having so many conversations about it lately, and I'm even seeing it more and more pop up on things like social media. Like I saw a Facebook post in a mom's group this weekend about a gal saying, I think I have high cortisol. What do I do about it? Right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is such a bigger conversation, obviously, than a Facebook feed, because as you'll start to hear from me talking about today, it's not about ooh, what can I take for high cortisol? It's why is it high in the first place? What is that leading to? What are the downstream ramifications that we're seeing that a lot of people aren't necessarily connecting with cortisol, right? So let's just start off high level and level set a little bit. What is cortisol? What is she talking about? Cortisol is our body's main stress hormone, right? We're going to talk about the functions of cortisol. Is it all bad? Heck no, it is not all bad. Our body creates it for a reason. It loves it. It's just like a Goldilocks hormone, right? Like most things in life and most things in the body, I'm always trying to get people to find a balance with these things, right? It's I don't want your cortisol levels through the roof, but we also don't want them non-existent, because neither of those extremes feel good and they show us bodily dysfunction, right? So a lot of people with cortisol imbalance, I will tell you right now, they feel really crappy, but without specific labs, sometimes they have no idea why they're feeling crappy. And because of that, especially like I said, we talked about functional labs and kind of functional lab interpretations versus medical labs and what each of them is beneficial for, right? But there's becomes this internal dialogue, especially when you're dealing with cortisol related issues that don't easily show up in conventional lab work, at all, right? So you're going to go to your doctor, you're going to feel like crap, you're going to get the internal dialogue of don't be a baby, get over it, deal with it, power through, right? Or you kind of get it echoed chamber of feeling like a hypochondriac or something, if you go into your doctor's office with these very legitimate symptoms and very legitimate concerns. And a lot of times I see individuals that have been struggling with what they don't realize is cortisol dysregulation issues for years. And the longer that we let it go on, the more devastating the impacts can be mentally and physically, because cortisol really is the Achilles heel of the entire hormone hierarchy, right? If you've worked with me at all in my one-on-one programs or my group programs, you know what I'm talking about when I refer to the hormone hierarchy. If you're not familiar with it, head over to Renew University and start to download some of my free B workshops, and you'll start to see what the hormone hierarchy is all about. But we have to understand that cortisol is part of the hormones that take up the foundation of our hormone hierarchy, meaning if our cortisol levels are not optimized, if that brain to adrenal connection is not firing and wiring together, then that can make the whole hormone hierarchy crumble down, right? So I'm talking about stress, these stress markers leading to blood sugar issues, which then lead to thyroid imbalances, which then lead to gut issues, which then cause autoimmune conditions, which then flare up sex hormone imbalances, right? It's so you're talking about the root of the root of the root of the root of a lot of the problems that we go in for have manifestations in cortisol first, but a lot of us are kind of ignoring them and not really getting our needs met. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? So I think there's a lot of hype and education around cortisol right now, and rightfully so. I don't think that cortisol is bad though, right? So if you're out there scouring social media, a lot of people will make it seem oh my gosh, obliterate cortisol at all costs. We can't have it in the system. I'm no, there's actually really important functions of cortisol that we want to have present. We just want them in the right amounts and at the right times, right? So what are some of the functions of cortisol, right? So number one, it promotes the breakdown of energy or let's put it this way, promotes the breakdown of substrates for energy, right? So cortisol has the capacity to create energy out of nothing, right? That's like a very special and unique characteristic of cortisol. Now, does it have like some downstream ramifications of that? Yeah. Can cortisol travel and break down the muscle tissue and break down the lining of the gut and send those structures to the liver, and the liver can make new glucose for us in times of need? Yeah, it can. Do we always want cortisol breaking down our muscle tissue and our gut lining to do that? No, but it can, and it's a very important process, right? It's like otherwise you would literally pass out and you would not be able to regulate blood sugar for very long. You wouldn't even be able to sleep through the night if we didn't have an ability to create cortisol, right? Cortisol also maintains mood and emotional stability. Cortisol directs our immune system, specifically a marker that we call secretory IgA. Cortisol also directs our ovarian hormones for us women. It's a powerful anti-inflammatory hormone. It counters like allergies as well too, and helps maintain a resistance to stress, right? So cortisol is not all bad. And even if you've ever talked to somebody that has what we call like adrenal fatigue, which really is a misnomer, like your adrenals don't actually get fatigued, but you do develop what we call hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction, right? That's a mouthful, but it tells us that those individuals, when they start to like not create enough cortisol, ask them how they feel. They feel like absolute trash. They can't get out of bed in the morning. They have joint pain up the wazoo. They rely on caffeine for fuel. They are just like depleted, right? So we know that cortisol is not all bad. You don't want to just obliterate at all costs, but the magic becomes in understanding that we rely on this like very delicate balance between turning the cortisol response on, otherwise known as more of like a sympathetic nervous system response, right? Fight, flight response, and delicate balance between turning cortisol off, which is more of that parasympathetic type of response, right? So we need to have a yin and yang of both being able to turn cortisol on appropriately, turn cortisol off appropriately to achieve like the long-term physical, mental, emotional health that we're looking for here, right? So when we kind of thinking about like turning cortisol on and like the appropriate times to have something like a sympathetic nervous system response is when we might need to mobilize energy stores, right? Like there are times like between meals or when we sleep overnight, our body has to have the capacity to make glucose or release glucose from storage, or you literally pass out, right? So it's like there are times to turn on that cortisol response for energy, arousal, alertness, motivation, goal-directed behavior, right? It's like, that's great. And then we also have to have the balance though of like turning that cortisol or sympathetic system off and turning on more of a parasympathetic response for things like healing, repair, immunity, anabolic growth, right? Like growing and repairing the muscle tissue, not just always breaking it down, but being able to actually restore the muscle tissue as well too. So just know that at like a high level, before we kind of dive into some of the different stages of what that cortisol, when it starts to get wonky, know that the issues really arise, not just because cortisol is all bad all the time, but issues arise when the system is out of balance. That's really what it is, right? And this is why cortisol regulation is the Achilles heel of hormone health, right? So we have to understand that it really starts at the level of the brain, right? The brain or the body is always scanning the internal and the external environment through all of our senses, right? Touch, see, hear, smell, like all of those senses are sending inputs to the hypothalamus of the brain. The hypothalamus of the brain has to understand, like, is that chill? Is that a threat response? Do I need to then send signals to the adrenals, which are those glands that sit right on top of our kidneys, and tell the adrenals to create a stress response, right? So anytime that you experience a stress, now understand that a stress doesn't have to necessarily be a perceived event. We can actually create a cortisol response just based off our thoughts, right? And I see this all the time. And these are some of those like ruminating thought patterns, limiting belief thought patterns, like things that I help people work through, right? Because even just how we speak to ourselves and our own internal thoughts can be creating a lot of cortisol. It doesn't actually have to be happening. Now, there's lots of stuff that are actually happening to our body that designates a stress response, but it doesn't always have to come from like an external perceived stress, which is why this word stress is so difficult for some people to tease out, and why our body starts to whisper to us about cortisol being an issue and we kind of ignore it, right? Because we can't quite grasp it. We may not be able to delineate it. So we just wait until it becomes like a whole big issue before we really say something about it. And by the time someone usually chirps up, like I said, I'm like looking at someone that has like, oh, we have blood sugar issues, we have thyroid issues, we have gut issues, we have sex hormone imbalance issues. And they're like, so you're telling me I've probably had cortisol issues for like years? I'm like, yeah, like this probably started a long time ago, but the body whispers before it screams, right? And if we start to ignore some of those early signs and symptoms, which we'll talk about next, sometimes that then sends a lot of that downstream issue, and we don't usually chirp up about it until it's like a really, really big problem. And then we have to go back to the root, right? So that's where a lot of times if you don't have these systems in a good balance and you have that fight or flight system, usually is the one that's activated all of the time, that stress-induced cortisol release is only meant for like short-term release, and then we should be able to turn it off. But that's not how our world is made right now, right? Our world gets us so pegged in that sympathetic fight or flight that it's always on. And so we're always experiencing the catabolic nature of cortisol. It's constantly breaking systems down, like literally, right? Literally breaking and pulling resources from any available front, because it's not just going to let you pass out, right? You may not like the way that the body is compensating. It's like, ooh, I'm stealing a little bit from here, I'm stealing a little bit from there, and like it's sending these resources to the liver, right? And the liver's like, cortisol, where did you get that? And cortisol's like, don't ask, right? And it's like, you don't want to know where I got that from. Like, here you go, liver, just go ahead and make new glucose with that. And the liver's like, okay, I don't know where you're getting all of this, right? And so eventually the body, you literally are witnessing the body slowly starting to break down, right? If we're always in that cortisol nature or always in that fight or flight. So it's not always like how we perceive the event or the severity of the event itself, but it's more like our perception of it that's going to generate that overall stress response. So know that this is, like I said, kind of a progression of dysfunction, which is why from a conventional medicine standpoint, we don't do a really great job of identifying cortisol related issues. It's usually just a conversation of like, well, labs look normal, you should just manage your stress. And it's like, that is the most unhelpful piece of medical advice that you could possibly give somebody, right? And they're like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what to do with it. It feels kind of like hopeless, right? So that's not what I'm talking about here. We're talking about like, what are the sources of controllable stressors and what is my body constantly compensating to, and how does that show up as gradual dysfunction in the body, right? So we can kind of catch it. So the progression of adrenal dysfunction usually starts with some sort of like chronic stress. That could be inflammation, that could be infection, that could be blood sugar dysregulation, that could be the result of like under eating, over exercising, fad crash diets, not sleeping well, over caffeinating, excess alcohol, nutrient deficiencies, toxin exposure. I'm like, should I keep going? Right? It's like you can start to see, you're like, oh, so like my thoughts aren't the only source of my stress. I'm like, oh, hell no. I'm like, there's so many that we have more control over, but we have to kind of at least discuss all of them, right? Because we have opportunity to. So chronic stress, chronic infection is going to increase cortisol, right? That's number one. Thank you, body. You're doing a good job. Then eventually, when we see that chronic stress, the liver, right, the unsung hero of the body, the liver metabolism of cortisol is going to start to speed up to try to keep up with that, because the body knows well and good. It's like, I want to create a cortisol response. I cannot have you sitting in this cortisol response for days, weeks, months, years at a time, because I'm going to have system failure. I'm going to have system breakdown. So if you're creating a lot of cortisol, I need to upregulate the liver so that as soon as you're making it, you're getting it out. And as soon as you're making it, you're clearing it out, right? So that's a healthy response, right? So if we measure on different functional labs, like a Dutch adrenal panel, for example, is what I run with a lot of clients that are interested in this, in digging into this. We're going to look at free cortisol and we're going to look at metabolized cortisol, right? We're going to see like what's the body producing and how much is the body also getting rid of? What stage of that adrenal dysfunction are we in, right? So free cortisol goes up first, metabolized cortisol goes up second. Eventually, the adrenals also ramp up another hormone called DHEA, which is like our vitality, vigor, verve hormone to try to like protect us, because it's like, ooh, doesn't look like the stress response is going away anytime soon. I better upregulate some protective mechanisms as well too. If we don't deal with that stress, right? It's like free cortisol goes up, our liver starts to metabolize it more, DHEA starts to go up. Your body will let you do that for days, weeks, months, years at a time, right? Eventually though, if the stressor is not dealt with, eventually the metabolism of the cortisol starts to go down. So the liver starts to slow down. And so then the free cortisol ends up staying high. Right? We'll talk about that and what that looks like today. And then eventually the very last stage of that function is the free cortisol production level drops because of what we call this HPA axis dysregulation, right? So there's going to be stages of this. And that's where I think it's important to kind of understand, like, what are my symptoms? And my symptoms probably give me a little bit of an idea of like where I'm at along the spectrum, or if I'm dealing with either like some early stage adrenal dysfunction or cortisol issues, or kind of like some end stage, late stage, right? So let's really dive in. I try to make this simple, and I coordinated it into 3 different stages here, right? So let's just kind of talk about 3 different cortisol patterns that I most commonly see, and we'll start to like talk about what this feels like and kind of how to navigate these. So cortisol pattern number 1 is what I would call like a true high cortisol pattern, an overstimulated hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Like we are on overdrive, right? So on like a salivary test or like a Dutch test, for example, this would look like your free cortisol is high and your metabolized cortisol is high. Both of those arrows are pointing to the right direction. It's like, woo, we are just like overstimulated, right? So what does this feel like? Usually feels like difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. Usually feels like anxiety, irritability. Usually feels like I'm easily triggered or like frightened or kind of jumpy. Usually feels like GI issues, most of the time like constipation. Low libido. It can also feel like a lot of cravings, specifically sweet cravings, right? So you kind of think you're like falling asleep, staying asleep, anxiety, irritability, I'm easily triggered or like easily frightened or jumpy, like someone like slams a door and it's like, whoa, it's like, oh, it's just like you're easily triggered like that. Constipation, low libido, sweet cravings, all of those really start to paint this picture of like high cortisol, that system on overdrive, which is the earliest phases of cortisol dysregulation. Naming off that whole list, most people probably walk around with most of those symptoms. Do they do anything about it? No, they might take like, oh, I need an anti-anxiety med. And I'm like, that's fine if that helps you manage it, but like the causes and the triggers of what you're dealing with are still there. You're still going down the progression, right? It's like anti-anxiety meds are not stopping this train that's rolling through this adrenal dysfunction. It's just going to keep going because you're kind of ignoring the root causes of where this might be coming from if you're just going to slap a Band-Aid on it and walk away, right? So the goal isn't just to use like supplements or medications just to lower cortisol, but the question is like, why? Why is your cortisol high to begin with? Like address that, right? Supplements can always offer support alongside of this, for sure. I use them all the time, but they're not meant to take their place, right? A lot of times, especially if you're using like plant medicine for some of those things like different adaptogens and neurotropics, like those by themselves, their effects kind of tend to wear off about the first 60 to 90 days, right? Because even plant medicine is like, I'll help you out, but you have to do the work. Like, this is just me helping you bridge the first 60, 90 days while you make some major changes, right? That's what the body's trying to communicate with us with these symptoms. We don't usually interpret it that way, right? So when I talk about like why cortisol is high to begin with, I mentioned a few of these. Maybe it's stress levels, right? What can be taken off your plate? Do we need to talk about things like boundaries? Do we need to talk about things like commitments and like always saying yes? Do we need to talk about things like reciprocity? Like, those are some of the mental things that I talk about with my patients. But we can also address stress in terms of blood sugar management. We can also talk about stress in terms of exercise, either lack of or over exercise. We also want to talk about like going inflammation hunting. Like, is there some GI issues? Where are some sources of inflammation? Maybe we need to audit things that are coming into the system that cause stress, like caffeine, right? Stimulants. And we probably need to talk about things like sleep and circadian rhythm support, right? So there's lots of different things that I might unpack as potential sources of that stress, which obviously aren't going to be unpacked overnight, but though that's the work, right? And then we can utilize some supplemental support as a bridge at the same time, right? So that's kind of picture number one, is like high overstimulated adrenal picture where free cortisol is high, metabolized cortisol is high. Both arrows of something like a salivary Dutch test would be pointing that same direction to the right. Second level of adrenal dysfunction is going to be that free cortisol staying high, right? But the metabolized cortisol slowing down, right? That's kind of that middle stage where the liver's like, see ya, like I tried to get this out, but the stress wasn't ever dealt with. So now the metabolized cortisol starts to go down. So usually what we see with this now is like that middle of the road, right? We're not at full burnout mode yet, but we're kind of getting there, right? And so a lot of times, like, you'll kind of experience some of the same symptoms as that high cortisol, but you're going to get the thyroid entering the game at this pace, right? So now with that second picture, you're going to start to look at things like thyroid labs. Maybe someone is developing hypothyroidism now with that picture. You might feel like more rumination, right? Someone tends to like, I see a stress and I get stressed out and I just can't let it go. Like, I'm just like ruminating on it, right? Because the liver is not getting rid of that cortisol very quickly. Also, we tend to see more of the weight gain, especially around the midsection now, because the body's really holding on to that cortisol a lot more. And this also is someone that claims they're like, I can't sit still. I like sitting feels hard, relaxing feels hard. I can't meditate. I'm not a yoga person. I'm like, middle stage adrenal dysfunction, right? It's like you can start to see, and that's just kind of, like I said, educated guessing from like subjectively working with people for years. But you can start to see where their labs might be trending based off of their symptoms as well too. So that's kind of phase 2 picture, high cortisol but slow clearance pattern. Number 3 is going to be the true low cortisol picture, HPA axis dysfunction, some people calling it adrenal fatigue. Now, just know that the adrenals don't stop producing cortisol, the cells just stop responding to it, kind of like the boy that cried wolf, right? So on a salivary Dutch test, then this would look like both arrows pointing to the left, like free cortisol's low, metabolized cortisol's low, like this person is just depleted, right? So normally, what does this feel like? Difficulty getting out of bed, reliance on caffeine for energy, somebody that feels like they need a lot of rest or they're still fatigued, they're still tired even after a full night's sleep, joint pain, muscle weakness, like not recovering well from the gym, brain fog, depression, hypoglycemia, because guess what? Oh, the adrenals are responsible for keeping my blood sugar stable. So if my adrenals are now offline, then my blood sugar drops. So people end up getting hypoglycemic episodes, dizziness, frequently sick or ill. They might also experience cravings, but more salt cravings versus high cortisol tends to be a little bit more sugar cravings. Low cortisol tends to be a little bit more salt cravings. Fun facts, right? So you can start to kind of delineate how people feel based off this picture. So in that situation where someone is like depleted, we need to consider like how did they get depleted in the first place, right? Was this like life stressors events? Was this overtraining, underfueling, chronic dieting, burnout, perfectionism, lack of boundaries, trauma, right? What caused that burnout to begin with? And then what's going to replete them, what's going to restore them, and what's going to nourish them? So obviously, food. That's going to be a big part of an adrenal like restoration picture, thinking about adequate calorie consumption, adequate carbohydrate consumption, adequate protein and cholesterol consumption, because guess what? Cholesterol makes cortisol. So we actually need those two working together. Restorative movement patterns, deep sleep and rest. So when we start to think about like adrenal dysfunction, know that it tends to start early. A lot of these symptoms are things that we can overlook very easily. And if we don't do anything about them when the cortisol levels are high, eventually we're maybe get into kind of that stage 2 before we get into full like stage 3 burnout picture, right? Now, the good news is regardless of where you're at on that spectrum, all of those are completely reversible. Amazing. And they all have a lot more specificity behind them than just like manage your stress. It's like, that's incredibly unhelpful. What the heck does that mean? What do I do with that information, right? It's like we need to have some specific strategies of what that looks like. Can we use supplemental support regardless of where you're at? Heck yes, I use it all the time. But if we don't know where you're at in that picture, we could accidentally use the wrong support, right? So for someone that's like, has a high cortisol picture and they don't test or they don't really know, you might loop in an adrenal supplement that's actually an adrenal glandular and it racks you up through the roof even higher. It's like, nope, that's probably not your picture. Or if you're actually in the low depleted picture and you start to use supplements and herbs that help lower your cortisol, I'm like, you're already in the basement. I'm like, you don't need to lower your cortisol more, right? You need something that helps pick those up, right? So it's very person to person specific, which is why I don't make supplement recommendations on things like this, because everybody is going to be different and you can actually cause yourself like more harm by taking the wrong things. So the goal of thinking about like adrenal dysfunction more from like a functional medicine lens or perspective is we have to correct that HPA axis. We can use functional labs to help give us a better idea of like where are you at on that spectrum, not just going based off your symptoms. And you're not going to measure cortisol very well in the bloodstream. Let's just be real. It measures best in the saliva or the urine. So we can use some functional tests to do that. So we want to correct the HPA axis. We want to reset those feedback loops, right? The brain and the body. We want to bring the body back into balance, right? It's not about swinging one way or the other or just saying like cortisol is bad, obliterate it at all costs. It's like we need to restore that balance, right? And that normal function of cortisol and DHEA using nutrition, using lifestyle, using gut support, using supplemental support. All of those things can be part of the treatment strategy to restore that picture. It doesn't just have to be like anxiety and depression medications forever. It's like, well, there's probably something else kind of going on behind the scenes too if we're wanting to dig, right? So we really want to hit the reset button and kind of get back to baseline of how much stress has had an impact on physiology, physically, mentally, and emotionally, right? So hopefully that kind of helps you guys a little bit. Think about, I know pictures are always nice. I try to talk with my hands as much as possible. But when you think about like, or you see a post or you see a blog or you see something out there talking about cortisol, it's like, oh, I know more now that cortisol isn't always bad. I don't want to just obliterate it, but if I'm not consciously aware of my cortisol, that's where a lot of these downstream issues tend to come from. And individuals with blood sugar issues, thyroid issues, gut issues, liver detoxification issues, estrogen imbalances, sex hormone deficiencies, I'm like, probably all had a cortisol issue first. Right? It's like the Achilles heel. So it can be a great place to start in your functional wellness journey for sure, to really kind of identify and understand how your lifestyle habits, nutritional habits are having an overall impact on that adrenal axis and therefore the entire hormone hierarchy. So if you're interested in any of those functional labs, I order those for my clients all the time. I do that within my one-on-one practice. So if you are interested, you can always go to the link in my bio and click the link there to apply to work together. we'll start with some basic labs and we'll kind of dive in from there. So hopefully that was helpful. If you guys have any follow-up questions, drop them in the comments below. And I'll be excited to see you guys next week for another Learn with Flo.